On this episode, the Brown University shooting investigation and the press conferences that failed. Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Blangiforti, and this is Truth, Investigations, and Criminal Behavior. So let's talk about the mass shooting at Brown University that happened back on December 13th. I'm also going to talk about the connected killing of a Massachusetts Institute of Technology professor, which occurred 2 days later. Let's walk through what happened and talk about how communication and leadership decisions affected public opinion and potentially the investigation itself. Now, this isn't a critique of frontline officers or detectives. It is, however, a professional analysis of decisions that were made at the command level, the information that was disseminated and when, the overall messaging choices, and how leadership communicated them during this case. Okay, what happened? On December 13th, 2025, at approximately 4:03 p.m., a shooter opened fire inside a classroom in the Barris and Holly Engineering Building at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. The building was being used by students for a final exam review session when the attack occurred. We came to find out that the building and just outside of the building had limited interior and exterior surveillance coverage. More on that later. The suspect fired multiple rounds into one of the rooms before fleeing the scene. Unfortunately, there were casualties. 2 students were killed, and 9 others were injured in this tragedy. Now, before I go any further, I think it's important to remember who was lost. Ella Cook was a sophomore at Brown University. She was 19 years old. She was described by friends and family as thoughtful, engaged, and deeply committed to her education and campus life. She was involved in student organizations, including being the vice president of the Student Republican Club. She was building a future that never had the chance to unfold, and her death should not be considered a statistic. It's a life that was needlessly cut short. Muhammad Aziz Umerzakov was a freshman at Brown University, and he was just 18 years old. He was described by those who knew him as kind, intelligent, driven, and someone who aspired to become a neurosurgeon because he wanted to help others. He was in that building attending a study session with classmates when he was shot and killed. And like Ella Cook, he was a young person at the very beginning of his life. The victims' families and the Brown University community were thrust into profound shock and grief. Providence and the surrounding area were certainly alarmed by what happened. I mean, after all, there was a mass shooting and a suspect was still on the loose. Initial police response included Providence Police, Rhode Island State Police, FBI, ATF, and other federal partners. They all responded to the scene within hours. The initial response, obviously, was within minutes, but it became a multi-agency effort to locate the suspect. Let me just tell you what the priorities are for responding law enforcement officers. When they get there, the first thing is to render aid to victims, search and clear the building, secure the crime scene as well as any potential witnesses that need to be interviewed. Then the crime scene will be processed by crime scene investigators. Witnesses will be interviewed by detectives, and they'll also conduct a video canvass and interview people in the surrounding area. Now, because there was no suspect in custody, they needed to get a description out to all law enforcement agencies and to the public as soon as possible, along with any video evidence that they obtained. Then the manhunt began. Press conference was held that evening where officials shared what details they had about the shooting, and they also asked for the public's assistance. The casualties were confirmed that there were 2 fatalities and 9 injured. We learned that a suspect was not in custody and that there was a multi-agency response. So the investigation was active and all efforts were being made to identify the suspect. They were unable to provide any specifics, including suspect description and any known direction of flight. The details were limited due in part to what they called the sensitivity of an active investigation. It did not appear that leadership and public officials in charge of making decisions and providing important information to the public were very experienced in crisis communication. There was what certainly appeared to be uncertainty on what to disclose and when, which created the appearance of being secretive. So that led to a lot of frustration and anger from the media and the public. Their communication strategy during the press conferences, in this case, would later become the focus of intense public and media scrutiny. We eventually found out that investigators traced the movements of a man identified in surveillance footage in the Brown area prior to and after the shooting. Prior to the attack, the suspect had been seen around campus and in nearby streets throughout the day. Those images were released and broadcast. Later on that day, they had another briefing, which was more of a follow-up and clarification. There had been messaging circulating publicly, including internal alerts that had implied that someone may have been detained. They needed to correct that information and reaffirm that there was no suspect in custody. In the next briefing, they spoke about the initial response to the shooting and that they could now confirm that a person of interest was identified and questioned. This was widely reported in the national media and interpreted by many as progress. Why? Simply because they stated that they had a person of interest. But what some people fail to realize is that a person of interest does not mean that that person is being criminally charged. It's a mistake to breathe a collective sigh of relief just because a person is in custody. Person of interest simply means that law enforcement believes they may have a person that has information relative to a case. Now, this individual was detained briefly and subsequently released after investigators found no evidentiary link. It became one of the earliest points of disappointment and frustration for everyone in the Brown University and Providence communities, as well as the observers across the country who were watching the case very closely. It was, after all, national news. In a high-profile investigation, every law enforcement action, every press conference, every facet becomes part of the story and subject to public scrutiny. Now, the next day, on Tuesday, December 15th, put a strong emphasis on the investigation continuing, their review of video evidence, but they still had no named suspect. And it seemed that after the person of interest was released, the public perception changed a little bit, almost as if the investigation had stopped. It certainly had not stopped. I mean, teams of investigators were working around the clock. Now, the next briefing, it was learned that 2 days after the Brown University shooting, another fatal shooting occurred in a different state. On Monday, December 15th, a physics professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology was shot multiple times at his home in Brookline, Massachusetts, and he later died from those injuries. Nuno Loureiro was a professor of physics at MIT. He was an internationally respected scientist, a mentor to students, and a leader in his field. Investigators later determined that the same individual responsible for the Brown shooting was also responsible for his death. So his killing marked a critical escalation, transforming this case from a campus tragedy into a multi-state and a multi-jurisdictional homicide investigation. The suspect had traveled from Rhode Island to Massachusetts, could now be literally anywhere. I'm certain that there was significant pressure on investigators to follow every lead, to interview every witness, and to locate this suspect immediately before he could kill again. Now, the connection of the MIT professor shooting to the Brown shooting became clear through evidence that was compiled from the multi-state, multi-jurisdictional investigation. A civilian tip came in from the Brown University vicinity. He had encountered a man near Brown and believed it might be of significance. That tip mattered. Now, it turned out that this witness was a homeless man who was a former Brown student who was found to be living in the basement of the building where the shootings took place. But his tip led to the identification of a vehicle, a gray Nissan sedan with Florida plates, and the suspect. Now, investigators traced the vehicle to a rental agency in the Boston area, and it was revealed that a car was rented near Boston and was seen on video in multiple locations consistent with both the Brown University and the Brookline, Massachusetts shootings. Investigators were able to link financial records, rental agreements, and surveillance images, which provided a detailed timeline of the suspect's movements. Then it was revealed that the same vehicle from Brown University had also appeared near the home of the MIT professor. This is what the phases now of a real investigation looks like. See, it's not all handed to you on a silver platter. Pieces of information, and you put them together at the time. Now, the breakthrough in this case came through putting those pieces together like a puzzle. On Thursday, December 18th, after an intensive 5-day manhunt involving federal, state, and local law enforcement, officers executed a search warrant and discovered a body inside a storage unit in Salem, New Hampshire. He died from an apparent self-inflicted gunshot wound, and a satchel was found with 2 firearms, one which was linked to the Brown shooting and the other to the Loureiro killing in Brookline, Massachusetts, along with an undisclosed amount of ammunition and some other personal items. Investigators were then able to identify the suspect as Claudio Manuel Neves Valente. So the next press conference on this latest information was held that same day. They provided all of the evidence tying the suspect to both shootings. They informed the public that the manhunt had officially concluded. It was learned that Valente, a 48-year-old Portuguese national, had previously attended Brown University as a doctoral student in physics, but withdrew from the program in the early 2000s. This revealed his connection to Brown University. They also found out that both Valente and MIT professor Loureiro, whom he killed, both attended Instituto Superior Técnico in Lisbon in the late 1990s. That showed his connection to Loureiro. His last known residence was in Miami, and the investigation also revealed that he arrived in the U.S. and relocated to the Boston area in the fall and had been living in the Northeast. Additionally, the investigation revealed that the suspect had been in Providence for at least 2 weeks before the Brown shooting, surveilling the campus, which he was already familiar with. Officials asserted that Valente acted alone and that there was no evidence of additional undisclosed suspects. Public and media discussions were focused on his possible motives, including possible academic pressure, unfulfilled ambitions, and or emotional distress as factors in Valente's actions. Now, this final press conference marked the end of the manhunt, but not the end of the questions. There would be no interrogation, no arrest, no trial, no full accounting from the suspect himself, and no clear motive. So there was nothing to celebrate here. I also just want to respond to some of the critics who commented on my Facebook page about that the police had dropped the ball. Now, detaining and releasing a person of interest isn't failure or dropping the ball. It's just investigation. But when it happens publicly and without context, it can unintentionally cause public doubt or alarm. The real critique is with the leadership officials and the messaging throughout this investigation. It's my belief that clear, effective, coordinated, and honest communication is paramount, especially in a major investigation like this. From a law enforcement perspective, this case underscores the complexity of real time decision making, communication strategy, and public engagement under extreme pressure. Their communications were criticized for limited detail on suspect description, a heavy reliance on these generic phrases like, it's an ongoing investigation, there's no immediate danger, then releasing confusing details about persons of interest, which caused a lot of confusion and frustration. A professional standpoint, authorities often balance investigative integrity against the threat to public safety. Not all details can always be released publicly without sometimes jeopardizing forensic leads. We sometimes want to keep evidence confidential in the event it can be more helpful to the overall investigation. I remember on a homicide case, we did not reveal a fact that we knew about the victim being pregnant, as that being released could have hampered our case. However, tone and pacing of their briefings were widely perceived by families, observers, and the press as repetitive. Now, should the public have been alerted sooner? Why was the shelter-in-place messaging limited to just the campus when this guy was still out there? Leadership kept praising coordination with other agencies, stressing teamwork rather than results. Now, which do you think is more important to the public? Having spoken at several press conferences myself, I can tell you that the press will be very hard on you if you don't know what you're talking about. I can also tell you that accurate details matter, and enlisting the public's help as early as possible is important. I remember we had a homicide case involving a young woman being shot to death by MS-13 gang members. We identified the suspects. We had credible information that they may be headed to Mexico. So we held a press conference enlisting the public's help, and a tip came in. We followed up on the lead that led us to their location. We arrested both suspects, and they were eventually convicted of this murder and went to prison. But here's the reality. You don't evaluate an investigation by how it ends. You evaluate it by what happened while the threat is still out there. I was watching the last press conference after the suspect was found dead, and they had all of the information on the results of the investigative efforts. It appeared that they were taking a victory lap about the interagency cooperation and the combined efforts, even thanking specific people, but there was no victory here. Professional investigators, detectives, and law enforcement personnel followed the evidence as they received it, which led them to the discovery of a dead suspect. He murdered 3 people. He shot them to death and seriously injured 9 others. What if the MIT professor's death could have been prevented? I don't know, but I'm reasonably certain that the family, friends, and colleagues of his were not pleased with this celebration of sorts. At least that's how it appeared. Now, in the aftermath, critics, including some federal officials, pointed to insufficient surveillance coverage in the targeted building, delayed specificity and suspect details, communication choices that may have affected public perception and action. A couple of observations that I made was that the president of Brown University said that they had 1,200 cameras on campus, but the only ones that would have mattered were the ones that weren't there. Also, during the final press conference, the Attorney General of Rhode Island, according to CBS News, stated that we are 100% confident that this is our target and this case is closed from a perspective of pursuing people involved. Okay. But if I've learned anything in my experience is that you never say 100%. And you always want to exercise extreme caution before ever saying that a case is closed, even if you meant it relative to pursuing people involved. Investigations do not end simply because the suspect is dead. His motive remains unknown. We are sadly left with just speculation, reason, conjecture. Questions remain unanswered. The truth is, folks, that this investigation is just beginning. There are many truths still out there that need to be discovered and reported, and they will, because that's what detectives do. I'm Mike Blangiforti, and I'll see you next time on Truth, Investigations, and Criminal Behavior.